In this exterior architectural photography edit, let's transform these raw captures into this. Although this architecture photo was taken during the evening, the editing tips and tricks that I'm going to show you in Lightroom and Photoshop will be useful for most architecture and real estate photos. I really love photographing architecture and homes during the evening period, that blue hour when everything just seems to come to life, all the lights sharp on the house, and it really is such a different look from the same property that I shot earlier in the day. If I show you that one and jump back into the early part of the day, same kind of framing we've got going on here, and this is what the house looked like in pure daylight, and you're just getting such a different look in the photo when you're shooting it in the evening. Now currently this is an unedited photo, this is a raw image straight from the camera. I have a bracketed set of 3, so this is like a base exposure, and you can see the high contrast that exists within the histogram here. We've got a heavy and dense distribution in the shadows, and then we've got not much going on in the mid-tones right through to the highlights as well. And so that is why I've shot 3 exposures, because I really don't feel that I've got enough information here to work with a quality edit. Yes, absolutely, we could bring up our shadows, we can bring down our highlights, and thankfully I have enough dynamic range in the sensor that I'm recording this on so that we could get a workable image, but the quality is just not going to be there. If I zoom into the shadows, you can see this high level of noise, and that is something that I always want to avoid if I can. That's why I have a brighter exposure. I could possibly have even gone brighter still, but if I'm bringing that brightness level up here, the noise isn't as evident as it is in this boosted version on the base layer. So let me just reset this and let's get to work on this. So I'm just going to work on this base layer to start with, and then I can copy across the adjustments that I make. The first thing that I want to do for my profile is to actually set that to a camera matching profile, and I want to work with something that's as flat as possible. So straight away when I choose the flat profile, you can see the difference between going for something that's more vivid or even a standard. This is very high contrast, and I don't want that. I want to kind of flatten out that contrast, and that's what the flat profile does. Even the neutral profile is still too contrasty for my liking, so I'm going to go with the flat profile for this one. And that is what I normally apply to all of my architectural work, even stuff where I've shot in the interiors. Again, this is not a finished image. I have various different shots I have to composite, some with the flambient technique, and yes, I do use flash in my shots as well. So a lot of you have been asking me about exposure blending versus flambient technique. Which one's better? Why flambient is so much better? People tell me that as well. But I use both, and I choose the technique that is appropriate to the situation. Anyway, that's a discussion for another video. Let's just get into making this look pretty good. So usually when I import my photos, I will already have some of these settings turned on, such as removing the chromatic aberrations. I'll enable the profile corrections as well, which is really important when you're working with architecture. I will then come in and I will usually use the guided approach for correcting the geometry. Sometimes you can get away with auto, and I will use that when I'm just sending a batch of proofs back to my clients so that they can actually make their selection of which photos they want to license from me. And that's always a good idea, just to get things done really quickly. Just try and get them a rough proof back so they can get a sense of what potential is there within the file. They can make a decision. You haven't wasted too much time. And then when a client says, yes, I want to go with this photo, then you can start refining your edit and making sure it looks good. So I like to use the guided approach because it's a lot more accurate than letting Lightroom guess the result for you. So my main goal with this initial edit on the base layer is to get it looking pretty good overall. I want to have a relatively good exposure. I do want to be able to see my shadows and my highlights, but I'm not too worried about getting them perfect by any means, because that's where these other 2 layers are going to come in to save the day. However, I want to give myself a pretty good foundation to work from. So I may just boost up the exposure just a little bit here. It's a good idea to work with the color temperature and just check that you're happy with it. But you're never going to get 100% accurate color balance at this time of night, because you have 2 distinct light sources. You have the interior lights, which have a very orange hue, and if you color match for that, as in set the white balance based on that information, then everything else is going to go really blue. And then the white around the property here, if I set my white balance based on that, which is reflecting the blue from the sky, you're going to see that then the interior lights do go very orange, and then where you have the building in more shadow, that is still blue. So you said, well, what's correct? What white balance is correct to select from here or to set it from here? Depending where you're sampling from to set that white balance point, you're going to get a very different reading and a very different look. So personally, when I'm working with these kind of files, I actually just like to grab the temperature slider and toggle it left, toggle it right, and just kind of find a sweet spot where I feel it looks good. And to be honest, the split in white balance that we have between the orange and the blue color hues, I actually really like that, and it's one of the characteristics that make these kind of photos taken at dusk so unique. So I'm not going to fight against it, I'm going to embrace it. The tint is also worth grabbing, and just check that you're happy with that. And if I have to go one way or the other and I can't get it quite accurate, I will usually err on the side of pushing in a little more magenta than I would green, but I try to get it as neutral as possible. And something like that's pretty good. Now the contrast slider is something that people will often want to take into a positive direction. Of course, we want to add more contrast, therefore more interest into our image. However, when I'm working on particularly contrasty scenes, I will actually take this into the negative direction, particularly to start with. Yes, it's flattening everything out, but I want to give myself access to a full dynamic range in my tonal range to work with. And so if I set my contrast there or too high, I'm not giving myself enough dynamic range. Contrast is something that I can bring back into the image later once I've built the foundation of the image. So I'm actually going to take my contrast into the negative territory. I may even boost the shadows slightly, and then bring down those highlights because I want to control those. Now, I'm not concerned about making sure that I have all of my highlights recovered over here, because for one, the colors are getting pretty muddy doing that on this particular file, and I'll be much better off doing that with the darker exposure here, because we're going to get much richer colors in those highlights. And that's where the combining of the best elements from each of these exposures is going to come in to our benefit. But for now, I'm going to carry on working on this base file and make sure I'm happy with that. I'm going to grab the white slider and actually push that up. So yeah, we're overexposing these areas, but again, I'm not concerned. I'm bringing back a bit of contrast, and I'm going to be able to work back in those details based on this darker exposure. The blacks look like they need to come down just a little bit as well, and what I'm looking for is just to basically be touching the black point at the start of the left hand side on the histogram. And if you want to see where you're overexposed and underexposed, just press the J key on your keyboard, and where anything turns blue, that's warning you that you're clipping the blacks, and everything that's red is saying, hey, you've blown out those highlights that are overexposed. And so I just like to see a tiny bit of black in my images, denoted by a little bit of blue, and I'm not too afraid if I've actually peaked out quite a bit of the highlights here, because I'm going to bring those back. I like to introduce a fair bit of clarity in my architectural work, not 100%, but just for demonstration purposes. Architecture tends to be able to handle a lot more clarity introduced into your photo than can other genres, particularly such as portraiture, for example. Somewhere around +22 is usually good. And as for the 𝗍𝗪 slider, I don't really like to introduce too much of this, because I feel like your image falls apart pretty quickly when you do that. However, it can enrich colors and also add a nice sense of contrast as well. So sometimes I'll just put in a little bit of 𝗍𝗪s. From here, I'll grab the vibrance slider and just have a little play. Bit of saturation as well, but as you can see, we're starting to push those oranges far too strongly if we push that up too far. But I do like to make sure that I have a nice bit of saturation built into these raw files that I'm then going to work on, because if you're going to introduce saturation, you're much better to do it while the photo is still raw than try and push in some saturation later once you've already done processing. And this is obviously because there is a lot more data available to us within the raw file, so we can bring back those colors, bring back that saturation much more accurately based on that data set in the file. In terms of working with the tone curve, which I love to do, it's not something that I like to do at this stage of my edit. This is something that I can work on in Photoshop once I've combined these three photos. Jumping into the hue, saturation and luminance section is often very beneficial when you are working with photos taken around dusk, because like I say, there's often very strong blues, very strong oranges, and you can actually control that. So for example, if you decided that you didn't really like the look of the lights being particularly orange, you could push them more towards a yellow, push them where you want to within that palette. You can also do things like darken down the sky if you wanted to, if it was still slightly brighter than you were hoping for, or if during the shoot the evening had got away on you a little bit and you wanted to brighten it up, you've got the ability to do that as well. But personally, in these type of photos, I quite like a nice rich blue, so we'll just drop that down a little bit. In terms of when you should add sharpening, personally, I don't like to add any additional sharpening to the base amount that Lightroom applies. Yeah, a little bit of sharpening is okay, but if you start adding too much and you start to see little halos around the edges of things, that's just going to make it harder for you when you're trying to blend these photos together. You're better to do the blend on a limited amount of sharpening, perhaps even with a slight bit of noise reduction as well, and then you can add sharpening as a later step in the process. When I send back my proofs to my client, my main way of controlling my brightness values isn't to do what we're doing here, which is exposure blending, which is by far the most accurate and professional way to do it. I like to take the approach that I'm doing here, which is literally putting gradients over the top of your image and controlling the exposure and the brightness that way. So I was just finding that the driveway here is just a little bit dark, a little bit of a black hole with limited light. So I'm just going to give that a slight boost by putting a radial gradient with a nice strong 100% feathering going on, just to lift up the brightness area there. I also feel like this little area of the property as well is just a little bit of a black hole. I'm going to create another radial gradient that I'm just going to drop over there. Again, we're 100% feathering, so it's nice and soft. I find when you feather from the center all the way out to 100%, the changes that you're making, such as boosting exposure, boosting shadows, it tapers off so evenly to the edge that no one would even know that you've made a change there. And one little tip I'd like to give you is when you are boosting up particularly dark, shadowy areas, oftentimes the blue that is in the sky, that ambient blue is reflecting off of there, that starts to show up a little bit more, and so you may want to just counteract that by boosting up the temperature. So by cranking that up to a +10, I think that's a little more accurate looking than when it was reset to 0. So adding in some warmth, taking it away. This is where it is sat naturally. I like to just boost that up a little bit. Okay, so let's have a quick look at without those localized adjustments, and let's turn them back on. So we've just boosted up those areas that are particularly dark just a little bit. So here's our before, here's our after. Now I'm just going to synchronize those effects across the darker and the brighter exposure. So I'm just going to shift click on the last one, turn off my auto sync, click synchronize, check all, and then synchronize that across. But now we need to get these two files ready to be merged with this one. So we're bringing back the best of each of these photos. So the first one I'm going to work on is the darker exposure, which was one stop darker than our base exposure. And in this file, I need to make sure that my highlights are looking good. So I'm going to bring them down slightly and also double click the exposure to reset that to 0. Now all of a sudden we've got a lot better color information through here in the sky. So all I want to play around with here is the tonal range. Nothing else is going to change because I want to keep that all identical to the base layer. That's going to allow us to create this seamless merge. So one thing I like to do is just double click the white slider because that was introducing a little bit of color anomaly. It just gets a little funky where you take that too far. I would sooner lift the whole exposure, and that's going to keep those colors more subtle and more accurate. Now this next bit of information is key. This is really important for creating a believable merge. What you want to do is lift the shadows and the midtones without any regard for how they look in terms of does it look like a good photo in this particular image. All we're trying to do is going to match the tonal value of our base layer in the midtones and the shadows, because that way it's going to make for a really believable and seamless merge when we bring them together. So I'm just going to bring the blacks up. I'm going to grab the shadows and bring those up a bit too. And I'm just keeping my eye on the thumbnail here, and I'm looking to create parity between these two. So I may have just taken the blacks just a little bit too high. Something like that's pretty good. So here's our base layer with the overexposed highlights, and here's our darker version with the correctly exposed highlights, but also shadow and midtone information that pretty much closely matches what we have on our base layer. Like I say, that is key. I get so many questions about that, so I just wanted to really drive that point home. Now, as we move on to our brighter layer, this is what we're going to use for bringing back information into the shadows. Now, our initial base layer is not too bad overall, and we could get away with blending just these two layers together to create a nice composite. However, I do also want to really take care of those shadows and make sure I've got the best quality in there possible. So we're going to do similar to what we did for the highlights layer. We're going to make sure that the exposure is okay. I'm not going to concern myself with overexposure in the highlights or things not looking great there, because we're not actually going to be using that information in our final composite. but we do want to try and match that pretty similarly to what we had in our base layer. And again, that's going to make for a more believable merge. But what I do want to make sure of is that my shadows are looking good. I want to make sure that I still have a nice amount of contrast. And so I may actually introduce just a little bit more clarity and make sure that my blacks aren't drifting up. And if we look at the shadows in the base layer and compare that with the shadows we've just created here, in this version, in this layer, we have a lot more information that we're going to be able to bring back in, whereas this is looking a bit lifeless and a bit muddy in the shadows. So that is why we're going to steal what we have available to us here. So now I'm going to take these 3 photos into Photoshop and create our merge. So we're going to click on the first one, shift click on the last, right click, and we can come to edit in, and we've got a couple of options. What we can do is open as layers in Photoshop. And when you get confident and you're happy with the edits that you've made in Lightroom, that is the way I'd recommend doing it. However, when you're just starting out, I actually think a better way to do it is to open as smart objects in Photoshop. And then if you need to make adjustments because things aren't merging quite as well as you would like, you still have access to all of this raw information. So for now, I'm going to open it as smart objects just to show you that approach. So with our base layer active, what we want to do is drag in the highlights and the shadows layer. So with a fresh window here, I just drag across and I hold the shift key down so that I know that that's aligned nicely. I'm going to pull the shadows, break that away from the bar there, hold shift again and drop that in as well. Okay, so now we have our 3 layers, and this is the order in which I like to layer them up. I have the base right at the bottom of the stack. I'll then have the highlights on top of that because that's the next thing that I like to introduce into the image, and then beyond that I work on the shadows. Now looking at all 3, you could argue that each of these files is a usable file to actually send back to a client, maybe not exactly like this but with a bit of tweaking. However, I always like to give the best quality possible, and so that is where this technique comes in. And often when you're dealing with architectural photography, you are going to come up against much more extreme contrast examples than this, where the exterior versus the interior, there's such a differential between the two, and you need to have a technique up your sleeves for actually bringing back those highlights. And so this technique can be applied not just to this style of photography, but any architectural photography. I use it on like 90% of my work. So what we need to do to introduce the highlights from this layer into the underlying base layer and the highlights only is use a luminosity mask. So as you know, that's a method of masking based on the brightness of each pixel in your photo. So I like to use the Lumenzia panel because that can quickly select those highlight areas for me. And depending how many highlights, you can actually make that adjustment really quickly. So if you are an architectural or real estate photographer and you want to employ this technique, then I would absolutely recommend getting hold of this panel, and I'll put a link to it in the description below because it's such a massive time saver. If you think the $40 for this panel is too much, well, first of all, I would seriously recommend that you need to assess your business model and how much you're earning from doing these jobs, because it really shouldn't be a consideration. But if it is, you can come into the channels panel, for example. There's other methods as well, but you could actually just use one of these channels for your luminosity mask and then be applying that to this layer. However, I like to do it with Lumenzia because it's much quicker, gives you much more control and precision. All you need to do is click on the L button, which represents how much of the light. So the tighter you want that mask to be, you can come down to L6. If you want quite a wide mask, you can go for just a big fat L here. But I usually find somewhere around L2, maybe even just a little less than that, and you can actually take that to more specific amounts like 1.75 here just by using this slider on the side. And once you're happy with that, all you need to do is make sure that the layer is selected that you want to apply it to, and just click mask. Lumenzia now creates a mask for us based on those brightness values, and now when I turn on that layer, we can see only the highlights. So look at that, it's brought back all of those lovely highlight details and it's done it seamlessly. Here's our base layer with no highlights recovered, and here we are with all of that rich information in the highlights recovered. In terms of highlights, we're pretty much perfect. The only bit that's a little concern is this little hot spot here, but we could also take care of that. I might do that in a little bit, but for now, let's take care of the shadows. So this is our layer that we're going to be working on for shadows. and we're going to introduce that into what we've created here. And so just like before, when we used 𝗨𝗀𝗲𝗃 to select the light component for our mask, we can come over to D, which represents dark, click that, and now we can select the darks in our photos. It's just such a useful tool. The tighter you make this mask, the more obvious it's going to be that you've introduced a different layer, and the wider you make this mask, the more seamless that transition. But I prefer to have a big difference between the white and the black areas. Currently we've got white and grey, so the big fat D, this is no good. Perhaps D2 might be the way to go. I still feel like that might not be quite right, and D3 doesn't have enough whites for my liking, so I'm actually going to move the green slider somewhere between 2 and 3 just to make that selection a little wider. And now once again I just click the mask button right here, and currently we don't see the shadows until I reveal the eye tool, and there you go, we've brought up detail in those shadows. So I'm just going to zoom into a little bit of this photo, and we'll go back to our original, and we can see that the highlights are blown out, the shadows are very dark, very noisy. And now I've got the best of both worlds in terms of bringing back detail in the highlights, and I've brought back some nice interesting detail in the shadows as well, while I've also minimized the noise that was there. So this is without the shadows, this is with the shadows added, before and after. Nice bit of detail. This is without the highlights and with the highlights. Now I mentioned this little hotspot just here, and I'm going to take care of that, and it's easy to do because we have this layer as a smart object. What I can do is do a new smart object via copy. That's going to make an exact replica of this layer, but unlike when you make a standard duplicate, any changes I make here to the exposure, for example, that is not going to affect the layer underneath, and that only happens because I've done a layer via copy. So now I have that available to me. I'm just going to see if I can control this, and unfortunately I could have done with an extra exposure in camera. It's still overexposed. It's not going to be great bringing that back, but this darker exposure may be better. As you can see, I've boosted up the shadows and the blacks just to try and help blend this in again. I'll click OK to update it. And all I'm going to do is just hide it and throw away that initial mask that we had. And this time I'm going to create a new mask that is much tighter based on that. So all I've done is press L5, and straight away we've made a nice little selection around that. I can press mask and show that layer, and I've been able to bring in some information there. But unfortunately, because it was already overexposed and unrecoverable in my raw file, there's nothing I could do about that. But let's say you took a bracketed set of 5, unlike 3 like I did here, we would have been able to save that area with this technique. And this is really cool because now what we've got in front of us here is a beautifully exposure blended image that is exactly what I'm looking for as a foundation to allow me to go on and finesse my edit. We've got all of that rich, lovely tonal range that I'm after. And now I can come in and do things like work on the colors, do any retouching if I need to, and also refine the contrast. So let's do that. What I like to do is merge my layers with the monster shortcut Control Alt Shift and E, and that's going to combine everything that we have visible on our screen down onto one layer. I'll usually call that retouch, and then what I'll do is actually just zoom in and start working my way around the image. So for example, I've got a little dust spot here with the patch tool, and just sampling from other clean areas and replacing areas where I have anomalies. So a little bit of dust spot there. And I just glance my eye over the building and just check for any errors. Even things like odd leaves on the driveway, I like to just clean those things up if I can. And also areas that bug me as well. I might stamp this area out here because it's very bright because of the little light they had down here. So I might just sample some of this grass, make my brush a bit bigger, and just sort of paint that over the top. And I'm not going to be worrying about being too precise here, because at the end of the day, people's eyes are not going to go to the corner of that frame. Like, I know that's a very rough and ready bit of cloning going on there, but yeah, I'm really not worried. Even things like this leaf just here, I might just like tone that back just a little bit. I like to use the clone tool. I also like to use the patch tool and also the spot healing brush tool just for retouching purposes. And if you would like me to cover a video about what I use when and go into more detail on that, just write retouching in the comments below and I'll know that's something of interest for you guys. How far you take your retouching is really up to you, but for example, little things like just this slight discoloration here, I like to actually clean that up for my clients. And that is the sort of thing that if you're doing real estate photography, you want to display the house as it truly is. But if I've got areas of dirt that shouldn't be there, and this is for an architect, then I'm absolutely going to come in and just try and clean that up for them. So before and after, you know, just clean that little patch up there. And as I move around the house here, I can see that I've actually overlooked something, and that is the tilt of these blinds here. The daughter of the homeowners was actually at home in her bedroom, so I didn't really want to disturb her too much or get too fussy about things. But basically, little things like the shutter angle of the blinds in the top half here versus the bottom half, the fact that they're different, that actually bugs me. So I want to actually create a sort of uniformity within my images as best I can. You know, little subtle little things like that can actually really make a difference. So all I'm doing here is borrowing from this part here, and I'm just going to start introducing that on the same position as this slat here. As soon as I've clicked once that's aligned, now I can start borrowing from there and painting that in. And my opacity is at 50%. I obviously want 100% of that, so it's a complete cover up. So I can do that, start painting over. And as I've got down here, this very last slat isn't flipped quite the right way, so I can just borrow one more and do the same again there. There's a slight darkening on the side of this bit here, so I'll just sort that out as well. And it's not looking too bad. I could have done a better job of this. I also could have matched the angle just by creating a separate layer for these and then using the transform tool just to match the angle as it should be truly. Didn't do the best job with these ones, so I'm just going to sort the edge of this out and around here as well. Alright, that's not too bad. Could be better, but it's okay. So the next thing I'm going to do is actually fix up what I consider to be lighting anomalies. Things that catch your eye and distract the viewer, maybe subconsciously, but as a photographer they stand out like a sore thumb. So the shadow that's being cast by this really cool tree here over the wall is really distracting, and I want to see if I can actually fix that up. And when I do this kind of fix up, what I like to do straight away is try and make my selection of the area as quickly as possible. So usually I will just grab the quick selection tool and just see whether that gets me close enough. And in this case it has. What I'm going to do again is make a new copy of that retouch layer, just so if I make any mistakes I can just jump back to that original one there. And all I'm going to do is just start painting the colours that exist around this shadow, just around the edge here. And that's going to enable me to then come in with a patch tool and basically get rid of this line in one go. I'm just going to discard that selection that I had, because as you saw that was really quick to actually do in the first place. And this time what I'm going to do is just come in and select this line and now borrow from a similar textured area that is plain. And just release, and just like that it's gone, and we have a nice transition through those colours there. And if I want to get a little bit more refined, I can then come in and work on this area as well. Have a look at before and after. The rest of this shadow I'm probably just going to leave as it is. I may just soften it down with a very little light pop of paint of a sort of intermediary colour somewhere, sampling from here by holding the Alt key. And then just one click, and that's just going to soften that down. It's still there, but it's not as evident as it was. The changes in tone and colour on this pillar here, that also bugs me as well. So again, I can come in with my quick select, grab that pillar fairly quickly, and now I'm just going to freestyle paint over this area to try and blend it in. So I'm going to sample a colour somewhere between the orange and the blue, so that's going to give me a kind of mid-tone. And now I can come in and just start painting over the top of that. And although that's a very flat colour, it doesn't have any texture, I don't think anyone's going to notice that. So here's our before and here's our after. And for me, it's just a kind of visual cleaning process. All those little lighting discrepancies, they just make the photo just a little bit too busy. And for example, the hot spot that we tried to clean up here, we didn't really do a very good job, or I didn't do a very good job of it. And so what I can do is just come in, sample a colour here, and just kind of tame it back a little bit. So we still have a brighter area here, but it's not overexposed or that muddy kind of white that we had created. And with this kind of retouching, you can go as far as you want to with this. For example, this area here, this discoloration, I would love to get rid of that. So I'm going to for the architect, but again, if this was for a real estate agent, I wouldn't be worrying about this. Also, this level of detail, this is what I like to bring for my clients, and that's what allows me to actually charge more for my work as well. So if you do want to start upping your prices, charging more, then you do need to become more mindful of details like this. So to patch this up, I'm just going to need to do a couple of sample points because I don't have enough to steal from there. And now you can see that we have a pretty hard transition between these two areas. That's where I'm going to come in, drop my opacity sort of halfway, and that's going to allow me to kind of create a nice transition between those two areas. I can then steal from the brighter bit as well. Maybe that's too bright, maybe just from here, and just bring that up slightly. And now when I deselect and we zoom out, we've gone from this with a very bright hot spot on that aluminium there to just toning that right down. Again, it's not perfect, but it looks way better from this to this. We've got a similar issue going on the underside of this with all these light beams. Whether or not you leave stuff like that, it is entirely up to you. But using the paintbrush tool, sampling a color that already exists there, and then just sort of transitioning that through nice and softly. I'll just crank the amount up just slightly just to get this done a little bit quicker. Even just leaving some of the effect, so you're not removing it completely, just softening that up like that can just make it a little bit easier on the eye. But unfortunately, you can see where that quick mask has let me down there, so what I'm going to do is just come along here, select that rough edge, and just delete that. Okay, I really want to give you guys a complete workflow, a complete edit here, and so let's dive into fixing up some of this color, because I know that color casts are an issue that a lot of people have when they're dealing with architecture. And as you can see, this front plane of the building, it's got a lot of discoloration, looks a bit weird. Like, I mean, it does work in with this evening light, and it is how it was. However, what if we wanted to just clean this up a little more? Well, one thing we could do is use the Lumensia panel. So for example, let's say we want to work with the hue and saturation, and we want to just drop that saturation down, and that's to control the building itself. I don't want that affecting the sky. I don't want it affecting too much of this, but let's say this is the kind of look that we're going for. Well, what we can do is just hide that layer temporarily, come back in again, click the M tool this time, so that is the mid-tones, and as you can see, we now have a dual tone image that we can use for our mask. Where it is black, it's not going to reveal anything. Where it is white, we will see the adjustment that we've made. And so I'm going to apply this mask just by clicking the mask button. And now when I click on the eye tool, we can see that control of the saturation. But it's also desaturating the sky. I don't want that. There are ways I could do that here. And just with that selection made, I can just select the mask and fill that with black, therefore stopping that hue saturation layer from affecting the sky and only affecting the building. So we're just toning down some of those bright oranges, some of the tonality on the building there, and it just looks a little bit more believable. So that's one approach you could take using Lumensia. There are other masks available to us as well based on color, so it's a really useful tool. However, another thing you can do if you're just using Photoshop would be to come in and actually select these areas. So what I'm going to do is just come up to the select option in the menu, come down to color range, and click on this front facing side of the building. And we can then choose the eyedropper with the plus icon to add to that selection if there's more areas that we want to include in our changes. So I'll just come along the areas that should be white, perhaps this side panel here. And we've got our preview of our mask here, but it doesn't need to be super precise, and I'll show you why. So I'll make that selection, and with that selection active, I'm now going to come in and select a curves layer. Now what I want to do is just come in and brighten this up. Now what's happening, why this is going to a more clean white at the moment from what we had before to now, is happening because when you add luminosity, i.e. brightness, to a color, the saturation actually drops away. So this is our before, this is our after. Obviously our mask is not good, we've got a lot of bleed where we don't want it, and so we use one of the techniques I absolutely love, which is double masking. And I do that by adding a new folder, a new group, and that's just sat there at the moment doing nothing, and we just drop the layer that we want to double mask into that group. I'm now going to select the group and put a mask onto that. Nothing's changed yet, but when I invert that with Control I, we've hidden everything, and that is now going to give me the ability to come in with a white brush and paint the effect, in this case the curves, but it could be any effect, any layer. We can now paint that back in. So I'm going to increase the size of my brush, click once, and as you can see, now wherever I'm painting, I'm introducing that effect. I'm set at 100% opacity, which is a little bit too much. If I press 5, I go to 50, might still be a little bit strong, so I'm just going to work with a 30% opacity, and now I can just come in and brighten areas up selectively. Might be a little bit overcooked up here, so I'll just bring that back by switching my brush to black, and we just see a little before and after, drop it back just a little bit there as well. And let's show our hue saturation layer as well. I feel like those colours are just getting a little bit tepid, particularly with the orange. So while I like what it's doing to a certain extent, it's a little bit extreme. So I'll just play with the opacity to get that kind of about half that effect. Okay, as a final step, let's readdress the contrast. Things have got a little bit washed out as we've gone along with our processing. So I'd like to reintroduce a nice richness to the shadows and the blacks. And again, 𝗨𝗀𝗻𝗄 is a great way to do that. There's many different ways you could work with contrast, and I have a plethora of different tools I use for it. But I just want to show you, since we've touched on 𝗨𝗻𝗻𝗄, I'll show you how you can do that with this. I'm just going to select the darks in 𝗨𝗻𝗻𝗄. So that is going to select predominantly the dark pixels. So anywhere that it's actually showing white at the moment, that is where we're going to have the most effect of what I'm about to do. Where it's black or dark grey, it's going to have a limited effect. So what I want to do is, again, open up a curves adjustment, use the mask that we've created through 𝗨𝗻𝗻𝗄, apply that to those curves. So currently nothing's happened because we haven't made any changes. But now you'll see as I grab the slider and start to drop that down, we're adding more contrast. You might think, well, why is that different to just adding curves normally? Well, it's masked specifically into the shadows only. So if I drop this down pretty heavily and then come down and disable the mask, that is the true effect that this curve adjustment is having. Whereas when I enable the layer mask, you can see that it's only affecting the shadows. What we've got going on there is way too much at the moment. Let's just go for something like that. And then I may make a stamped visible layer again with that monster shortcut, Control-Shift-Alt-and-E. And let me just show you one of my favorite filters as well that I'll usually use on every single architectural photo I produce. And that is the Nik Collection ColorEfex Pro. And if you want to get a hold of this, I've got a link in the description below. It's an affiliate link, doesn't cost you guys any more, but I do get a small commission from that. So it really helps me out with creating this free content for you. So if you've got value out of this video and the free information I'm sharing with you, and you like the look of this tool, please use that link. That'd be much appreciated. So on the left, you can see some presets that I've created for my architecture, and they all predominantly use very much the same sort of tools. They're just slight variations on a theme, but this tool is so great for bringing out detail for your architecture. I mean, for instance, they've just introduced this intensity slider, which, just like all sliders, it's very rare that you'd want to go to 100% for anything, but a little can go a long way just in enhancing the photo. So let me show you a couple of my favorite filters that I like to apply. So let's add in some contrast. We'll go to the contrast section and we're going to add some pro contrast. There's a couple of different sliders in here which I really love. So there's correct contrast, which can really help to pop back in some of that contrast that we might have lost through doing this exposure blending. So that is a really great tool. A little goes a long way again, but the one I really love is the dynamic contrast. This is so useful for so much architecture. So again, I'll push it all the way to 100 so you can see what's going on. And then if I do a little split screen and we take it from the before to the after, you can see just how enriching that is. Obviously, we don't want to use it anywhere nearly that strong, so we can just dial that right back. But as a finishing touch, if you save this as a preset, you can just bulk apply this to all of your photos once you've finished your editing. You could export them as TIFFs, a batch of TIFFs, and then just throw those TIFFs at ColorEfex Pro to just bulk apply the adjustments that you make here. So it's a really nice, quick way to improve your photos. So here was our before, here was our after with the contrast. There's another one I'll show you that I really love as well. Within the architecture section, we have the detail extractor. So I click the plus icon and that's going to add it to the stack. So we've still got the pro contrast, and you can turn things off with the tick icon there. So that's with and without the contrast. And then the detail extractor, which has gone way too over the top. But as you can see, it really brings out the detail. So if I zoom in here and we look at the before and the after of the detail enhancer. Again, you can argue a little goes a long way. Personally, I like to have this set really low, somewhere around that sort of like 5 or 6% amount. You may want to add back in some contrast, because by adding the detail extractor, things can get a little washed out looking. And so normally I will counteract the addition of the detail extractor tool just with a little bit of extra contrast. And not only does ColorEfex have some really practical tools like we've got here, you can also get a little bit more creative as well. So if I jump back to fit here and I jump into the portrait section, we have access to a filter called Glamour Glow. So if I click the plus icon, that's going to add the Glamour Glow to this photo, and I'm going to turn it off and turn it on, and you can see that it just softens things off slightly. So you know, normally you'd think, well, that's not really appropriate for architecture, certainly not 100%, but you know, maybe you do want to just ease in a little bit of this. And sometimes I find the combination of adding detail through the detail extractor, but then softening things up with the Glamour Glow can actually be a really nice combination. So if I take those away and the clear view as well, we're going to add this in. So here's our clear view effect. Nice. We can add a bit more contrast with Pro Contrast. And then we're going to add back in some of the detail. Hard to see when we're zoomed out, but then we can soften that off with the Glamour Glow. So overall, we've got our before and our after, before and after, nice bit of pop. This overall effect is probably a little bit too strong for me, but if we click apply, the cool thing is we now have this available to us on a separate layer, so we can either do a couple of things. We could reduce the opacity so that we can say, hey, look, we like that effect, just want 43% of it. Or we can be more specific with our masking. So for example, if we had it set to 100% and we added a mask to that, we could try selecting the subject. And Photoshop hasn't done a great job of that. So instead what I'm going to do is actually select the sky and press Alt Delete so that I'm removing that effect from the sky, because I just felt like it was getting a little bit over the top with the sky. I can deselect our marching ants. And with my brush set to 30%, I can just start painting around the extremities of the photo, because I don't want the effect as strong towards the edge of the frame. I want people's eyes drawn to the middle part of the photo, which is the hero of the shot, the architecture. And if I'm happy with my mask, I can then come back again and play with that opacity. So here's none of that effect. Here's 20%, 50, 100 again. Look, if I set that somewhere around half of the effect, this is our before, this is our after. It's quite subtle, but it's a nice bit of pop. Okay, let's have a quick look at where we came from and where we've got to. It's a big leap from that initial raw capture to where we are now. Yes, there's a lot of steps involved in what went into creating this finished image, but I really wanted to share with you guys all of the potential steps. Now, you don't need to do all of this for every photo, and there are many other techniques that I use for other photos as well. So if you'd like to learn more about those techniques, please subscribe to the channel. If you've got video requests, leave them in the comments, and a click on the thumbs up goes a long way. Thank you so much for watching, guys. I wish you all the best for your photo editing, and I'll see you in the next video.